Hey guys, this lecture is on diversity. We're going to talk about what is a species. So take a minute, think about that. A species is a population that is capable of interbreeding to produce healthy offspring that can reproduce. The importance of this definition is that a population of organisms is able to they can interbreed, and not only do they interbreed, but they actually produce healthy offspring, and then those offspring that they produce can reproduce successfully. That's how we determine what a species is. So let's look at some examples. All right, so these two organisms, are they the same species? While they both are fish, right? So hopefully we picked up on that. They're both fish, but no, they're not the same species. So this organism here, this is going to be a swordfish. They live only in the ocean, and they're actually among the fastest fish, which is kind of a cool fun fact about swordfish. This you might have had for dinner last night. This is a salmon, and they are what we call anadromous. Does anybody know what that means? Anadromous means that they actually are produced in fresh water, and then they migrate to the ocean, and then they actually return to the fresh water to reproduce again. And it said that they actually return to the same stream that they were conceived in, which is kind of cool. Salmon are really, really interesting organisms, and how they're able to find their way back to certain locations is still something of research to scientists. But these organisms are of different species. So this swordfish cannot successfully interbreed with this salmon and produce offspring that would be healthy. There's many reasons why these two don't reproduce, but one of them is the fact that the swordfish is going to reproduce in the ocean, whereas the salmon is actually going to go back to freshwater streams to reproduce. So they wouldn't be in the same place at the same time when they're ready to reproduce. Okay, let's look at another example. So on this screen, you can see that we have, on this slide, we have squirrels. Same species? Different species. What do you think? Well, I put this slide in here to show you that appearances can be deceiving. While the swordfish and the salmon are both fish, and you can tell that, but they do look different enough to where you can probably guess that they were a different species. These are not that easy to guess whether they're the same species or not, because they all look very similar. So this organism here is actually the American red squirrel. This organism here is the eastern gray squirrel. And this organism here is also the eastern gray squirrel. So the eastern gray squirrel and the American red squirrel are both found. You'll actually find both of them in the same area. However, the eastern gray squirrel and the red squirrel do not mate. So that's mainly due to their behavior. The gray squirrel, you can actually see here, is larger, and it's actually more aggressive than the American red squirrel. It also can not only tell by behavior, but appearance and smell as well. So both of these will give off different scents, and that's how they know not to mate with each other. And so the biggest thing is the behaviors are just not the same. Even though they look alike, an eastern gray squirrel will recognize that this is an American red squirrel, and it will not want to mate with it. And the sad thing is the eastern gray squirrel, you may not have seen a lot of American red squirrels, because the eastern gray squirrel actually carries a disease. It's a virus that the American red squirrels are actually susceptible to. So they actually have reduced the populations of the red squirrels. Also, if you notice, they are bigger and they're more aggressive, and they will actually outcompete the American red squirrel for food. If you look over here to the right, you can see the eastern gray squirrel, but this organism here has a mutation in its genes, and so it is actually white. Now, in the wild, this organism is probably not going to be able to survive very long because of its coloration. Because it is white, it's going to stand out. As you can see here, it does in the leaves, and predators are probably going to prey on it first. Because of its coloration, it's an easy to see prey. But actually, both of these organisms here are eastern gray squirrels, which is pretty cool. So I put this one in here to show you that appearances can be deceiving when we're telling organisms apart, as far as whether they're the same species or not. All right, so here are some different organisms. Let's look at some similarities and differences of these. What are some similarities between these? Well, there's not too many. All three of these organisms were at one time made up of cells. That's the main similarity here. They all get and use energy. If you remember back from Unit 1, the properties of life, all of these will have in common. If you look here, the giraffe and the T-Rex obviously have appendages, right? So they have legs, but you can see a difference here is that the giraffe actually will walk on all four. This is called, so all four of these here. This is called quadrupedalism. And the T-Rex only walks on two legs, so it's called bipedal. And this is actually not even an animal like the other two. This is yeast, which is actually a fungus. What they eat is going to be different. So the T-Rex here is going to eat meat, obviously. You can tell that its anatomy is based upon that. So here, if you see its dental anatomy, you can tell that it eats meat. The giraffe is going to eat leaves. It's going to be a herbivore. The giraffe has developed this long neck, whereas the T-Rex has the long tail that helps it with balance. So you can see there are some differences here and similarities as well. All right, so how do we end up with yeast, which is a fungus, a T-Rex, which is very different from yeast, and a giraffe, and then a giraffe that walks on four legs, not two like the T-Rex? How do we end up with all these different species? How does the separation of species occur? Well, that's through reproductive barriers. And these reproductive barriers prevent members of different species from interbreeding. Let's take a further look at these reproductive barriers. All right, so let's talk about some reproductive barriers. The first barrier we're going to talk about is behavioral isolation. Here, organisms can basically identify each other for mating purposes via rituals, markings, or smells. Here we have a peacock, and peahens will only mate with males with large, beautiful, colorful feathers. The second reproductive barrier is habitat isolation. So organisms may never meet in order for them to reproduce. That depends on their location. Sometimes they're separated by mountains or water, and they never are able to travel over those geographical barriers, basically. An example of that would be the Asian and African elephants found on different continents, right? So the African elephant is obviously found in Africa, Asian elephants found in Asia. So because of the habitat isolation, those two specific organisms were not able to mate and reproduce. So an important note about reproductive barriers is that there are multiple reproductive barriers that can keep species separated, not just one. All right, so here we have mating time differences. So this cute guy right here is called a spring peeper. And spring peepers are the first species to begin mating in the spring, while other species of frogs are still overwintering. You can actually hear them even in March. They have a really cute call, and when temperatures start to warm up a little bit, you can actually start to hear these guys. So because they mate early, they stop overwintering early and they start their mating process. Other frogs are not out and about mating at the same time. Then we have gametic incompatibility, which means that if this organism releases its gametes into the water column, and this organism releases its gametes into the water column, they're not going to be able to fertilize each other. So basically, gametes are what we call sex cells. So another term for gametes, sex cells. Sex cells are going to be egg and sperm. And so the egg and sperm of different species actually can't fertilize each other. They're not compatible. The sperm will not be able to fertilize the egg, even if they are in the same area. It just won't happen. We have mechanical incompatibility. This one's probably pretty obvious, and there are plenty of examples, but organisms just don't have the correct anatomy to be able to reproduce with each other. Here, my example is an orchid. There are probably better examples, to be honest, than this one here, but that you can probably think of. But I love this example because this flower here, this orchid, produces this flower that looks like a female insect. And so the male insect will come over here and try to mate with the flower. And then he will move on to the next flower, thinking it's a female, and try to mate with it. And that's how this particular orchid species becomes pollinated. And so the insect doesn't and the flower are never going to be able to mate and reproduce because of obvious reasons, but one reason is mechanical incompatibility. They just don't have the correct anatomy to be able to mate. But the male insect doesn't know that. It thinks it's a female insect, which is kind of cool. This particular orchid also secretes pheromones or smells just like the female insect, which is pretty awesome as well, that a flowering plant can actually be able to do that. Pretty impressive, if you ask me. Then we have hybrid weakness over here. And so this is going to be when two species mate. So species 1, species 2, they mate, and the offspring is what we call a hybrid. But sometimes the hybrid is sterile, and that's the case here when we have a horse, a donkey, and they produce a mule. The mule here is going to be sterile. It's not going to be able to reproduce. Or sometimes two species mate and they produce unhealthy offspring. So remember our definition of species. That means a population that interbreed successfully, and that organism to produce healthy offspring, and that organism, the offspring, is able to reproduce as well. So here a mule would be an example of a hybrid weakness. Also, in captivity, they mated a Asian elephant and African elephant, but it was not very successful. I'm pretty sure that there were some complications during birth and shortly after the organism actually died due to the complications. So sometimes you just can't produce healthy offspring when two species reproduce. All right, so let's think about how we organize species. So how do we separate them and classify them? Well, we look at three main things: body structure, development, and DNA. Within body structure, we're looking at various things such as dental anatomy. Does it have a vertebrae? Does it not? Appendage anatomy, mobility anatomy. Does it have wings? Does it have fins? Does it not have any appendages at all? Does it walk on 2 legs? Does it walk on 4 legs? And then also mammary glands. In development, we have reproduction. We're looking at reproduction method. How does it reproduce? Does it reproduce sexually, asexually? Can it even do parthenogenesis, which is kind of cool? Yeah, so how does it reproduce? Is it does it usually reproduce sexually, but sometimes it can be asexually? Some organisms can do that. It's kind of cool. Um, does the organism give live birth? Does it have eggs? Or does it do both? Yeah. Check out ovoviviparous sharks. Pretty cool. The dogfish shark that we dissect in the seated class is an example of a ovoviviparous organism. And then parental care. So does the species even have parental care? Or do you pretty much secrete your sex cells into a water column and tell your young, good luck to them? Some organisms have different levels of parental care. And then we have differences in genes. Obviously, we can look at the DNA. So the classification of organisms is known as taxonomy. I want to talk a little bit about why we even bother to classify organisms. So you may be thinking, why does it matter that we know all of, I don't know, the insects in the US? Like, why would that be important? Well, sometimes we have invasive species or organisms that were brought over from another area. They're not native. They can actually outcompete native species and can be really destructive in the ecosystem. And so it's important to be able to identify, hey, this organism doesn't belong in this region. We know this is an invasive species, and then we can try to manage it. Another example, personal story here for you. I think it's important to be able to identify species because of an experience I had one morning on my way to work. So I was headed out the door late as usual and running out the door, and I open the door and this massive spider runs in. I'm absolutely terrified of spiders. Snakes, love them. Okay, reptiles can do. Spiders, even the smallest one can't handle. Anyways, so the spider walks in, runs in. It ran in. Let's not lie here. It ran in. Okay, and I'm thinking, okay, well, I can just walk out the door and shut it, and this spider's in the house now, and who knows where it'll be when I get back home. Or I can get rid of it now. So I thought, okay, so I had on my boots and I opened the door and I tried to like kind of kick it out. Well, it just like curled up in the corner, okay? And I was like, thanks a lot. You're really helping me out here. So I thought, all right, well, I'll go get a broom and kind of like sweep it out of the corner. And I thought, well, before I like sweep it outside, I should probably like stun it because I don't want it to like get scared that I'm sweeping it and start like, crawling up the broom or running in the opposite direction into the house. So I hit the back of the spider to stun it. And about 100 offspring just go running everywhere in my apartment. Yes, I have spider youngins everywhere. And I grab a can of Raid, and I'm sorry for those of you that love spiders, but I just had to. I didn't have any other option here. So I just started raiding all the spiders, including Big Mama. Poor thing. I felt so bad, but I didn't have much choice at that point. So then on my way to work, I was thinking, well, I got rid of Big Mama. I got rid of all of her offspring. So what happened to Big Daddy? And then I did some research. I found out that it was a wolf spider. They're native to North Carolina. I knew some species, like the species that are probably dangerous, like a brown recluse. You might know what that looks like, or you might know what a black widow looks like. But I wasn't thinking like, oh yeah, you should know the wolf spider. But I do now, and I read up about it and found out that it actually the females carry their young on their abdomen, which is kind of cool, on their back. And I read a little bit further and found out that I did not have to worry about Big Daddy because Big Mama had already taken care of him. It's called post-copulatory cannibalism, which basically means that after she reproduces with Big Daddy, she eats him for nutrients. So it's in her best interest to find a very fit male to reproduce with, because she's going to be able to get more nutrients from him, which is pretty cool. I think it's pretty neat. So anyways, didn't have to worry about Big Daddy. So my point here is, if I had known that it was a wolf spider and knew some characteristics about a wolf spider, like it carries its young on its back, maybe, hitting it with a broom wasn't the best idea, I probably wouldn't have had about 100 offspring running around my apartment. So I do think it's important to be able to classify and organize species and know some characteristics about them. So I want to get back to classification of organisms. So here we have our classification system from most broad here, which is the kingdom, all the way down to species. So if we go from most broad to most specific, we would end up with species. You can remember this by kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, or King Philip came over from Great Spain. Yeah, that's what I meant to say the first time. Sorry, guys. Anyways, I'm not asking you to be able to identify certain phyla or class or order, family, genus, species. I'm going to teach you a few kingdoms in Eukarya. But what I need you to know is that kingdom is most broad, phylum, then class, then order, family, genus, species is most specific. I need you to know those in order. And then the genus, and a few rules here, the genus and species are always italicized, and the genus and species make up what's called the scientific name of the organism. So the scientific name of this gorgeous sea turtle here is Chelonia mitis. Chelonia here is the genus and mitis is the species. Also notice a few things. The genus is always capitalized, so you can see that here, and the species is always lowercase, and both of them are italicized. So make sure you know those rules for classification and scientific name. A fun fact for you is that animal family names always end in IDAE. So they'll always end in IDAE or IDAE, which is kind of cool. At least I think. All right, so here are 3 domains of life. So the 3 domains of life are Bay. You've got bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Now, notice there are 2 other categories on this slide. You've got prokaryotes and you have eukaryotes. Bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes, and the domain eukarya is classified as eukaryotes. So let's start with the prokaryotes. So domain bacteria, these are going to be unicellular. They are found absolutely everywhere. Some can cause disease in humans. A lot are beneficial. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. Then we have domain archaea. Archaea are similar to bacteria in certain ways. They are both unicellular, but archaea actually have a different substance that makes up their cell walls, and they often live in extreme conditions such as environments that are really hot or salty or acidic, lack oxygen, things like that. And then if we look at domain eukarya, these are unicellular or multicellular. Humans would actually fall in eukarya, in the domain eukarya. And these are going to be much larger organisms. They're going to be very sophisticated cells. So let's talk about bacteria. We have helpful bacteria and we have some harmful bacteria. So let's go over a few examples. This example here is Lactobacillus, and it is found in the vagina. And it actually helps to keep the pH down or make the vagina an acidic environment, which helps to keep the harmful bacteria out. Because the vagina is an opening to the body, harmful bacteria can get in, and when they do, they won't be able to survive because of this helpful bacteria making it an acidic environment. Other helpful bacteria, there are bacteria that help plants to actually get nitrogen, and plants are going to be important for photosynthesis and providing us and other organisms with oxygen. So that bacteria is important. And bacteria also help to decompose. And one place where you might not think bacteria would be helpful, but they really are in wastewater treatment. So basically your wastewater, water that goes down your sink, goes down your toilet, leaves your dishwasher, your wash machine, your shower, and anything that also goes with that water that might be in that water ends up at the wastewater treatment plant. And there are certain types of bacteria that will actually eat away at the organic matter that is found in that wastewater. And basically it helps to clean the and get rid of the solids in the wastewater, which is pretty cool. If you're interested in wastewater treatment, you should take my Bio 140 class, which I offer every spring online. It's really, really interesting process, wastewater treatment. And then harmful bacteria. This example here is anthrax, Bacillus anthracis, I think. And then basically anthrax spores were mailed to US senators. 5 people actually ended up dying after inhaling these spores, and unfortunately it affects the respiratory system. Other harmful bacteria examples would be bubonic plague, so bacteria that cause bubonic plague, and also strep throat, which I have had many times. That's Streptococcus. All right, so here we have archaea. They live in extreme environments such as hot springs, swamps, cold waters, high salinity. There are 3 main types. There are methanogens, which live in oxygen-free or anoxic conditions. They release methane gas, which you can see here, and as bubbles. There are halophiles, which live in high salinity, and thermophiles, which are heat lovers. So they love hot springs, for example. So now I want to talk about the different kingdoms that make up the domain eukarya. So we have the plant kingdom, animal kingdom, we have fungi, and then we also have protists. And protists are the misfits. If it's not an animal, it's not a plant, it's not a fungus, it goes into Protista, kingdom Protista or protists. All right, so the animal kingdom you are probably pretty familiar with. The first vertebrates were fishes. Just a fun fact for you, about 95% of all animals are invertebrates, which means they have no backbone. All members of kingdom Animalia ingest other organisms to obtain their nutrients from their environment. All organisms in Animalia are multicellular. They have some sort of a nervous system, stages of life, and a reproductive system. Here we have the plant kingdom. So all members of the plant kingdom make their own food by photosynthesis. So all of them make their own food via photosynthesis. This is moss. Also known as bryophytes, which means that they're non-vascular plants, or basically they don't have roots that are deep, and they take up water from the soil into their roots and send it up the plant to the leaves where photosynthesis is going to occur. There's no vascular system there to move the water from the ground into the plant itself, and so that's why moss or bryophytes are actually found in wet places. So they're found where the water is going to sit more towards the surface of the soil, because they're not going to have very deep roots that go all the way down into the water table to try to get water. And then also, they're not very tall. So if you look at the moss, you can see they're not very tall, and that's because they don't have that vascular system to send the water and nutrients like a tree would all the way up the trunk of the tree. These are over here. This is another example of an organism in the plant kingdom, and these are called cycads. Cycads are found in the tropics, and they can actually live to be 1,000 years old, which is really, really cool. Cycads were believed to be around. There's fossils of cycads, so they're believed to be around in the Jurassic area. A lot of, not these particular plants that are found currently on Earth, but this type of plant, these cycads. All right, we'll move on. Kingdom fungi. So here, this we've already looked at is yeast. Yeast is going to be important in making bread rise. Also, if you are a brewer, you probably are very familiar with yeast. And there are many different varieties or species of yeast to help you brew beer. And depending on which one you use, can determine the flavor of the beer, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of science that actually goes into brewing beer and picking the correct yeast to do so. Can have a lot of effects on it. Sometimes brewers like to use wild strains of yeast because it can give the beer a different flavor. Brewer's yeast, there's a particular species, it's called brewer's yeast. It's Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the name of it. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and that's the most common yeast that brewers might use. Most fungi are multicellular. All members are going to decompose and absorb the remains of other organisms. A lot of them help to actually recycle nutrients in the environment. And there's over 100,000 species. And you can see they're pretty diverse. Here we have ringworm, which is not even a worm, an actual worm at all. It's a fungus. You'll have to take antifungal cream to get rid of it. And then we have black mold, which you can see here. It's found in very damp locations. Its spores, when it releases spores, can actually get into the lungs and cause respiratory issues. And then you can also see this dead tree over here is being engulfed with another type of fungus that's helping to decompose it. All right, and then the last kingdom is Kingdom Protista. Remember, I kind of mentioned these were all the misfits. You have algae, so this is kelp here, but algae fall into the Kingdom Protista. You have diatoms, which are over here. These are little phytoplankton that have a silica cell wall or little glass cell wall, and you can actually see that shiny glass or silica cell wall here. And you can also see how they're green. So they are doing photosynthesis there. They're little phytoplankton. One that's not pictured is Plasmodia or Plasmodium. And Plasmodium is actually the parasite that causes malaria. It falls under in the Kingdom of Protista. And we also have these dinoflagellates that you see here. They cause red tides, or they can, not all species, but some of them can cause red tides. And during these red tides, they can release toxins, and other organisms can actually die as a result, which is quite sad. A lot of dinoflagellates, the red tides occur because of excessive fertilizer being released into the water, which makes these quite abundant. But then they can also be what we call bioluminescent, so they can actually glow. So if you see all of these organisms here, I put the pretty ones, all the bioluminescent ones here that actually have a little glow to them. But these are dinoflagellates. Let me write that here. And then the last one I'll talk about are amoebas. There's many different genuses of amoebas. But one specific genus, Naegleria, it can actually be deadly to humans. So it is found in really warm fresh water, and it can travel up the nose to the brain because there's no blood-brain barrier there. If you take an anatomy class, you'll talk more about a blood-brain barrier, but if a substance goes up the nose, there's no blood-brain barrier to help kind of keep out toxins or substances that should not be found in the brain. And so there was a girl from Ohio who went whitewater rafting at the National Whitewater Rafting Center in Charlotte one summer. You may have heard about this on the news, and unfortunately one of these amoebas was in the water, and because it had been really warm, really hot recently, increasing the water temperature, and so they were found there. And as you do when you go whitewater rafting, you know, water gets up your nose, whatnot. And so she actually ended up passing away 11 days later, because it damages your brain when it gets to the brain. You may have heard of like brain eating amoebas. Well, they do damage the brain. And on that depressing note, I am done with Kingdom Pratista and this lecture video. Please let me know if you have any questions about any of the material. I need you to know a few characteristics and some examples of each of these kingdoms within Eukarya. Make sure you can identify the three main domains and some characteristics. No classification, the taxonomy we talked about, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, some rules that go along with the scientific name, and all those reproductive barriers I discussed. Thanks, guys.